So Radiohead just released this new game, kind of, although I don't think you can really call it a game because it doesn't have the endpoint that most games constantly push you toward. Instead, this seems to be an art exhibit specifically showcasing the creation of the music albums Kid A and Amnesia. These were albums that came out when you and I were young. We used to listen to it over and over and over again. And now we get to experience it in an entirely new way, through an entirely new medium. And it's pretty strange overall. I think one of the messages they give you early on is it's not even a game. When you download it, it specifies it's not a game. It's just an exhibition, right? And so one act of that makes it an exhibition is you get to choose where to go, and you can miss lots of things. It's like actually going to a real museum. You know, you sort of decide for yourself what interests you.
I pretty much wasn't able to make sense of most of it. I'm not necessarily very skilled with interpretive or non-prosaic things like that. The main takeaway for me was a lot of confusion.
Yeah, well, that is often the main takeaway from going to an actual art gallery, right? Mm-hmm. Especially nowadays, if it's like avant-garde art, which in this case, it sort of leans in that direction. Have you ever heard of the cut-up technique?
No.
Okay, so I know that Tom York, who's a singer and writer of a lot of the lyrics for Radiohead songs, he uses the cut-up techniques in his lyrics. And what that is it's like this avant-garde kind of beatnik style technique where you write out all of your lines and then you literally cut up the sheet of paper and then rearrange all the lines in order to avoid sense as much as possible. And I bring that up because that's his writing style with lyrics, but I think that the organization of the exhibition itself actually has that structure to it, in that it lacks structure completely. If you try to go through it and think of any kind of linear storytelling, I don't think you're going to accomplish a lot doing that. It's far more freeform, far more emotional. The music itself is cut up too. So you and I grew up listening to these albums.
Right. Many, many times I've heard both of those albums.
Yeah. Both albums were a major part of my growing up, or at least my maturing as a music listener. And so much of this exhibit is re-listening to a lot of pieces of those songs. But remix is probably too nice of a word. It's almost just cut together, and then you just get suggestions of the songs, or suggestions of parts of the songs, and you kind of get to hear them in a new context, in line with maybe some visuals strewn about. But I don't know how you felt, but I didn't feel like it was giving me a new understanding of the music. It was more just a new way to experience the music without clarification.
Yeah, well, it felt like it reminded me how little I remember some of the songs on that album, and it sort of felt like walking through a poorly remembered version of the music. Just remembering snippets, because you can hear just little, almost isolated aspects of the song, like just the vocals by themselves, or just a little part of the percussion or something, and it kind of it allows you to focus more on what's new about it, in my experience. You know, like sort of focus on the visuals and try to see this as a new art piece, right, that isn't necessarily referencing the original intent of the albums.
Yeah, one thing that it mimics is sort of the experience I used to have when I would re-listen to albums that I fell in love with over and over again. And sometimes your mind would notice peculiarities, little details, maybe the beat of the drums, or the way in which the voice will modulate that you hadn't heard the first time. It's almost like hearing it anew. And in this case, it's like they're forcing you to hear parts of the songs anew. They're sort of giving you that feeling of when you're re-listening to a song and you're noticing things, but now they're focalizing your view onto that thing, and they're making you notice it. And with the visuals in tandem, it's sort of like they're making you notice sort of emotional variances that exist in the song, or at least potentially exists. I don't think you went into this experience, but there's this section that I went through where there's 3 songs played back to back, and my memory is they were the full songs, or at least 2 out of the 3 were the full songs, and you're just stuck in a kind of like starlight visual of little stars moving fast all around you, and as you turn and spin, they sort of make lines of themselves, and the song is just playing. And this is a song I've heard a million times. You and I probably have heard both those songs millions of times, and it suddenly is this experience of living in the song, almost like being a part of the song, which is something I never got to have before.
Yeah, well, it reminds me a little bit of those experiences when I was growing up and I was listening to these albums, and I sort of have a synesthetic experience with them, which basically means that I tend to visualize something while I'm listening to music, whether it's something really abstract like just a bunch of colors or maybe even a story in my head. But it felt like the museum was almost like walking through like one of those infinite experiences that someone could have in their own mind, kind of made into a world that you could walk through. And one thing that I did think was interesting was how the museum metaphor was taken as far as to include other people, right, who are walking around, and you're sort of seeing them have these, in some cases, intense emotional reactions to what they're seeing and hearing. And I did think that was, it's still rather interpretive, but it feels like something that references just the way that people sort of connect to music differently.
Yeah, they're almost badly drawn background people, like they're stick people,
right,
with large heads, and you can almost forget that they're there, but they're always there, wandering with you, and presumably you're among them, right? Just another de-individualized person.
Right. Yeah, and they don't talk to you. There's no way to interact with them at all. They're kind of separate from you. So it gave me this feeling of kind of unity and isolation almost, in the sense that we are not going to interact, but we're all experiencing the same thing.
Did you know that prior to creating this game, quote unquote, they actually were going to have an art gallery?
Oh, no.
Yeah, no, they actually wanted to have an exhibition showcasing the sketchbooks and maybe some early versions of the music tracks for the albums Kid A and Amnesiac. But due to COVID-19, they had to cancel it. And so then this became like the backup. However, what's interesting to me is they actually are able to accomplish a lot more,
right,
in this virtual gallery than they probably would have in a real gallery. So, I mentioned this to you before we recorded that there's that whole Facebook/Meta thing.
Right.
Right. They've been renamed Meta. And their whole trajectory going forward is that they're going to create these virtual experiences. And one of the suggestions is like you can go to the Louvre, anywhere in the world, and you can visit and you can see the Mona Lisa yourself. And this Kid A Amnesia experiment really feels like a test of that concept. Not with a virtual reality headset, which is what the Meta thing is aiming for, but just simply in front of a screen, but having the choice of being able to decide what you're looking at and being forced in some cases to just rest with the music as they show you what they want to show you. And it's a very different way to engage with art. It's a kind of forced engagement to some extent when they put the music on and they kind of keep it playing and you can't move.
Right. It certainly reminds me of something that already exists to an extent, but it's a more extreme version of that, right? Like when you go to a museum that has a built installation, like there's one famous one that people are talking about lately, which is this arm that's sort of scooping blood-like fluid towards itself, and it's doing it in this way that almost makes you feel like the metal arm that's doing it has some sort of emotional interiority, and it's actually like throwing tantrums and feeling very sad about it, what its job is. And it sort of is like that, but so much more. It's so much easier for them to create these experiences without having to build a physical thing. So they can kind of let their imagination run wild. And it would be cool to see something like this again, just an evolution of this in some other form.
Yeah, there is a great deal lost in not having a physical structure. Like if it was actually there in front of you, you could feel the texture of the work, right? Like a lot of experimental art designs that you actually are actively pushed to touch these things. Now in this one, we lose the sense of touch, but what's added is an abstraction, many degrees of abstraction, where things can loop in on themselves in ways that are physically impossible, right? You can float through air. You can enter rooms that appear small on the outside, like the pyramid from the very beginning of this exhibition is only like, the size of a large room. But then once you enter in and you continue to go through doors within that pyramid, it becomes as expansive as a universe, or at least that's the sensation it gives.
Right.
right? So they can play with space in ways that they can't do in real life. And then of course, like the forced music is another aspect of that. It's certainly an experiment. One thing that it might be typecast into is the genre of walking simulator.
Right.
Because there isn't action. You're just walking. But unlike a walking simulator, which is constrained by you knowing that there's a narrative, and every step that you take that isn't progressing that narrative becomes a frustrating malaise that you have to drag yourself through. Because there's no narrative here, the pace is itself part of the experience. The space between things is itself part of the experience. And that, I think, is a benefit. Perhaps this is a direction that quote-unquote walking simulators can go through. This sort of open-ended, non-narrative driven experience where it's really just about the moment-to-moment engagement with feeling, engagement with tone, and maybe interpretation for its own sake. Yeah, there's a kind of pointlessness to this that maybe is different and appealing.
Right. Well, it's certainly experimental, and any kind of experiment like this is always good, especially for the medium of video games, which can sometimes be a little stale and a little geared towards entertainment just for its own sake. And so experimentation is always welcome.
One thing that this experience reminded me of, I don't know if you got the same sensation, was, remember Portal and Portal 2?
Right.
How sometimes you would get a glimpse of the backdrop, like what's behind the pristine, clean white walls of the main puzzle rooms. And it was so exciting to break through and see all the grime and the industry that's behind everything.
Right.
This whole exhibition, even though it was being showcased to us in a very like direct way, felt behind the scenes the whole time. We talked about the writing on the walls, right? The ways in which the rooms connect and expand and contract into each other, and there's an aimlessness. That to me feels a lot like what was in Portal 2. It's sort of that little tiny accidental nugget of something really intriguing about letting the player feel like they're in a place they shouldn't be. It's almost like we're in the mind of Tom York and Johnny Greenwood and all these members of Radiohead, and it's like we just get to see what little nuggets of experiments that they had. A lot of the notebook drawings are just experimental ideas written down. It's almost like reading someone's journal. Do you think it's an enjoyable experience?
It didn't feel so much like a celebration of the music. It felt almost sinister at times, which is interesting. I mean, because some of the most important parts of art are parts that almost aren't artful, that aren't artificial. And so there's this flailing quality to it that at least reminded me of some of the best songs of Radiohead. They go to such lengths, at least from what I understand of how they make their music, to meticulously create a song that doesn't sound like it was meticulously made. And so I think this game kind of reflects that, and I appreciate that as a fan.
And at least it gave me an excuse to listen to the music again. There's some bands that you remember fondly when you were young. Like I think of like Animal Collective or Mars Volta, and Radiohead is one of them, where you listen to them so many times that you just have to give yourself a break, and the break never stops.
Right.
You never go back. It's sort of like this sense like I will go back someday, but then you don't. And Radiohead is kind of like that for me. And it's just nice to have an excuse to hear these albums, which used to mean so much to me, and to kind of reassess them as an adult and still appreciate them as music. But I guess with this exhibition, I now get to consider them as crafts, as things made, as things constructed by artists struggling with their art, trying to capture an idea and how difficult it is to capture an idea, and then to put that idea into music, into something communicated. One thing that's interesting about music, separated from language and many of the other ways in which we try to communicate, is there are feelings that are communicated instantly in music that does not get communicated well at all in language. If you try to break it down into language, you actually warp the feeling so far away from what it is, whereas in song it somehow comes out wholesale, and because it gives you that feeling, or at least it elicits your ability to create that feeling yourself. And that's something quite special and unique. That's our latest video. I know it ends abruptly. We're figuring things out as we go. If you're curious to see where we go from here, please subscribe. We're a small channel. We get to experiment with all sorts of different formats. In some cases, we're going to do video essays about broad topics related to video games. We might do video reviews of games. We might do discussions like this. Each step of the way, we get to toy around with ideas and toy around with what we're capable of doing as a small channel. And you, as a new subscriber, get to see the growth of this channel. You get to see many of our experiments fail in glorious ways, and you get to sort of understand the process of what we're going through, trying to make a video game channel that is thoughtful and careful and filled with ideas worth pondering beyond merely whether the game is just an enjoyable thing to play. So subscribe if you're interested, and you can watch us grow. And leave a like if you'd like to share this video with others, and leave a comment with some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. It'd be great to have a small little community that just gets to grow alongside us. So thank you for watching this video. Be sure to check out our next one. Bye.